Max Thorne stumbled through the door of his sleek new Arcadia penthouse, the weight of the day pressing down on him like 1,000 suns. His tired eyes squinted at the dazzling city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. With a long sigh, he tugged at his tie, loosening it, and rolled up the sleeves of his beige linen shirt, revealing muscular forearms. The holographic display of his wristwatch blinked in confirmation. He was late again. "Saxa," he called, his rich baritone voice echoing in the vast, modern apartment. "I'm home. Are Liam and Ava in bed?" Out of the hallway stepped Saxa, the alien nanny who had been taking care of his kids ever since his wife passed away. With her striking green skin and long white hair pulled into a high ponytail, she was, in a word, stunning. Her fitted black uniform clung to her curves in all the right ways, and the deep neckline of the shirt didn't help the flood of thoughts that immediately swam through Max's head. "Welcome back, Mr. Thorne." Saxa's melodic voice soothed his frayed nerves. Her emerald eyes twinkled as she smiled warmly. "Yes, the children are tucked in and sound asleep. They were little angels as always." Max ran a hand through his tousled brown hair, his eyes tracing the delicate curve of her jaw. "Thank you, Saxa," he said, his voice softer than intended. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He reached into his pocket and handed her a sleek credit chip. "Your shift's over. I appreciate you staying late again." Her slender fingers brushed against his calloused palm when she took the chip, sending a jolt of warmth straight to his chest. He cleared his throat, trying to ignore the tension that hung in the air between them. "It's my pleasure, Mr. Thorne," Saxa replied, her voice gentle. "I love spending time with Liam and Ava. They're wonderful kids." "Please," Max replied, his heart thumping. "Call me Max. Mr. Thorne makes me feel like an old man." A playful smile tugged at Saxa's lips as she met his gaze. "As you wish, Max." His pulse quickened at the way she said his name. It was dangerous. Her gaze held his for a moment too long, before she broke the silence, her voice shifting to a more serious tone. "How was your day?" Max sighed, loosening his tie a little further. "Hell. Negotiations with the Brizen are a nightmare. Interplanetary diplomacy isn't for the faint of heart." Saxa's brow furrowed with genuine concern, and she placed a hand gently on his arm, her fingers warm against his skin. "I can only imagine the stress you're under. You're doing an incredible job, Max. I see how much you care about your work and your family." Max met her eyes, his voice rough as he whispered, "Thank you, Saxa. You don't know how much that means to me." Her emerald eyes softened, a look of tenderness crossing her features. The air between them thickened with an unspoken understanding, a tension that neither of them could ignore anymore. Saxa opened her mouth to speak again, but Max cut her off, his voice a little hoarse. "I was about to pour myself a drink. Want to join me?" Saxa hesitated. Her gaze flickered toward the children's room down the hall, her professional instincts kicking in. "I shouldn't," she said quietly. "It's late, and I should be heading home." Max pressed on, desperation edging into his tone. "Just one drink. You've earned it after watching the kids all evening. Please, Saxa, just one." She looked at him for a long moment, before the faintest smile played at the corners of her lips. "All right, one drink." Max led her to the kitchen, the space suddenly feeling too small, too close. The heat of her presence was overwhelming. As he retrieved 2 crystal tumblers and a bottle of amber liquor, his hand trembled ever so slightly. He poured the drinks, trying to focus on anything other than Saxa's proximity. As he handed her a glass, their fingers brushed again, and this time, the contact wasn't brief. It lingered for a fraction of a second longer than either of them was comfortable with, but neither of them pulled away. They sipped their drinks in silence, each stealing glances at the other over the rims of their glasses. The rational part of Max's brain screamed at him to stop, to remember that Saxa was his employee, his children's nanny, and much younger than him. But the primal side of him, the part that had been aching for months, begged him to throw caution to the wind. Finally, Saxa set her glass down on the counter, her emerald eyes darkened with unspoken desire. "Max, He placed a finger gently to her lips, his voice rough and full of longing. "I know," he whispered. "We can't, it's not right." Saxa's shoulders slumped, a flicker of disappointment crossing her face. She turned to gather her things. "You're right," she said softly. "I should go." Every muscle in Max's body screamed to stop her, to pull her close and kiss her until they couldn't think straight. But he stayed rooted to the spot, fists clenched at his sides, fighting the overwhelming urge to make her stay. At the door, Saxa paused, her eyes meeting his one last time. There was something there, something raw and vulnerable. "Good night, Max," she said quietly, her voice full of longing. "Good night, Saxa," he managed to reply, his voice hoarse and strained, as the door clicked softly behind her. Max exhaled sharply, leaning against the door as his heart raced in his chest. He downed the rest of his drink in one gulp, the alcohol burning its way down his throat as he tried to calm the storm of thoughts swirling inside his head. What the hell was he doing? Saxa was his employee. His kids adored her, and she was amazing at her job. They had an undeniable connection, but the age difference, the power imbalance, it couldn't happen. But despite the protest in his mind, Max knew one thing for certain. He was falling for Saxa, fast and hard, and there was no turning back now. As he made his way to his bedroom, his thoughts consumed by her, Max couldn't help but wonder what the future held. This was going to get complicated, more complicated than he ever imagined. But deep down, he felt a surge of excitement. Saxa had changed everything, and as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Days turned into weeks, and the unspoken tension between them grew stronger. Max tried to bury his growing feelings under work, but every evening when he came home to Saxa's warm smile and gentle touch, those feelings came rushing back. And Saxa? Well, she wasn't immune either. The lingering glances, the subtle touches, they both knew the boundary they couldn't cross. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Then, one evening, Max came home earlier than expected, only to be greeted by a heart-stopping scream from his daughter. "Daddy!" Max's blood ran cold, fear gripping him as he rushed down the hallway, ready to face whatever threat was hurting his family. But the scene that greeted him wasn't danger. It was heartbreaking. Ava was crying in Saxa's arms, sobbing uncontrollably from a night terror. Liam stood nearby, clutching his stuffed animal for comfort. "What happened?" Max demanded, his voice tight with worry. Saxa looked up, her eyes shimmering with concern. "Ava had a night terror," she explained gently. "She woke up screaming, and I couldn't calm her down." Max's heart twisted as he scooped Ava into his arms, her tiny body trembling against him. "Sure, it's okay, baby," he whispered, holding her close. "Daddy's here. You're safe." Saxa stood back, watching them with a mixture of concern and tenderness. She reached out to comfort Liam, pulling him into her arms, her touch gentle and reassuring. For a moment, Max forgot everything: the tension, the unspoken desire, the complicated feelings. All that mattered was his children. And Saxa. She had proven time and again that she would be there when they needed her most. The next morning, the weight of the previous evening's events still hung heavily in the air. Max sat at the kitchen table, his fingers tapping absent-mindedly against his mug of coffee. The day outside was bright, the city of New Arcadia coming to life with the hum of hover cars and the soft buzz of holographic billboards flickering to life. But none of that mattered right now. He could still feel Saxa's presence, the warmth of her touch on his arm, the softness of her voice whispering his name. It had only been one night, one moment of shared tension, one fleeting touch, and yet it had felt like 1,000 years, like an entire lifetime had passed between them. He ran a hand through his hair and glanced at the clock. His first meeting wasn't for another hour, but there was something in him, something urgent, telling him to get up, to go find her, to talk to Saxa, to break this silence between them before it drove him insane. But when he reached the living room, Saxa was already there. She was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the sprawling cityscape. Her posture was perfect, the black uniform she wore hugging her toned figure like it had been made for her. Her hair cascaded down her back in a silver waterfall, the sunlight catching it in a way that made it glow. She was beautiful, irresistibly so. The sight of her made his heart skip a beat, and before he could stop himself, Max was moving toward her, his footsteps almost silent on the polished floor. "Saxa," he said, his voice low, almost as if afraid to break the moment. She turned, her sharp green eyes meeting his. Her lips parted in surprise, but then softened. "Max, good morning." Her voice had that same melodic quality, but now there was something new in it, a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. Something that said they both knew this morning wasn't just any morning. They were no longer pretending the evening before hadn't happened. "How's Ava?" Max asked, his gaze softening as he remembered holding his daughter last night. Saxa nodded, her lips curling into a gentle smile. "She's fine. Fast asleep now, resting after the night terror. She's a tough little girl." "I'm glad," Max said, the relief evident in his voice. He stepped closer, his body instinctively drawn to hers. The air between them shifted, becoming thicker, more charged. Saxa didn't move away. Instead, her gaze lingered on him, on the way his brown hair fell across his forehead and how the worn-out linen of his shirt clung to his broad shoulders. She swallowed, the muscles in her throat flexing slightly. "Max, about last night," Saxa began, her voice uncertain, like she was weighing every word before it escaped her lips. "I didn't mean to make things awkward." He shook his head, the corners of his mouth lifting in a rueful smile. "You didn't. It was just a lot, you know." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. "Everything's just been so overwhelming lately. The kids, my job, and—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Saxa's expression softened, her eyes filled with understanding. She took a step closer, her green skin glowing in the soft morning light. "I understand," she said quietly. "You have so much on your plate, Max. But you're doing your best. You're an amazing father." The compliment, simple as it was, made his chest tighten. He looked away, suddenly uncomfortable. "I don't feel like it some days." "That's normal," Saxa said, her voice light and comforting. She was always so calm, so centered. The way she moved, the way she spoke, it made him feel like everything was going to be okay, even when he didn't believe it. Her fingers brushed against his arm, a fleeting touch. But it was enough to make the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The connection between them, the tension that had been building since that first day she walked into his life, was undeniable. Saxa took a breath and let it out slowly. "Look, I know things are complicated. We both know that. But I also know something's happening between us, and I'm not sure how to handle it." Max felt his pulse quicken. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say? That he was feeling the same way? That he couldn't ignore the attraction to her anymore? That it was like a fire inside him, one he couldn't douse no matter how hard he tried? He swallowed, suddenly painfully aware of how close they were. "I don't know what to do with it either," he confessed, his voice hoarse. Saxa smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and made Max's heart race. "Maybe we don't need to do anything with it right now." Before he could ask her what she meant, there was a knock at the door. The moment was broken, and Max stepped back reluctantly, trying to regain his composure. He looked over at the door, and Saxa followed his gaze. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Who is it?" Max called. "It's me," came a voice on the other side, Saxa's assistant, Lyra, a practical, no-nonsense alien woman with short blue skin and a perpetually tired look in her eyes. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation." Max sighed, frustration flickering in his chest. He was trying to have a real conversation with Saxa to figure out where they stood, and now this. "Come in," he called. The door slid open, and Lyra stepped in, looking at them both with a raised eyebrow. "Sorry, boss. Just wanted to let you know that the Brizzen delegation is asking for a meeting again, and they want to meet you today, in an hour." Max groaned, his shoulders slumping. "I can't catch a break, can I?" he muttered, half to himself. Saxa, ever the professional, immediately shifted back into nanny mode, her tone gentle but firm. "Max, you need to go. You got work to do. You can't let your responsibilities slip." Max didn't want to leave. He didn't want this conversation to end. But duty called, and there was no avoiding it. "You're right," he said reluctantly, his gaze lingering on her. "I guess I'll see you later then." Of course, Saxa replied softly, her emerald eyes holding his for a moment longer than necessary. Take care of yourself, Max. He gave her a small, bittersweet smile. I will. Thanks, Saxa. As he walked out the door to face the Brizen delegation, Max couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between him and Saxa. Something deeper than just the physical attraction. There was an understanding there now, a shared acknowledgement of the tension, of the unspoken emotions that simmered beneath the surface. And though he tried to push it aside, to focus on the endless list of responsibilities awaiting him, Max couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Saxa was no longer just his employee. She was becoming something else, something more, and the more he tried to fight it, the harder it became to deny. But Max wasn't the only one struggling to navigate the space between them. Saxa had her own fight to contend with. A battle of emotions, of desire, of a growing bond that neither of them could have predicted. And neither of them knew where it would lead. But one thing was certain. It was only a matter of time before everything changed. The Brizen delegation meeting was a disaster. Max couldn't focus. His thoughts kept straying back to Saxa, to the way her fingers had brushed against his arm, to the quiet understanding in her eyes. Every time his mind wandered, his frustration grew. How was he supposed to negotiate delicate interplanetary treaties when his heart was caught in a tug-of-war between responsibility and desire? The Brizen, a race of tall, sleek creatures with skin the color of molten lava and eyes that glowed with an inner fire, seemed to sense his distraction. Their leader, a woman named Vera, leaned across the table, her eyes narrowing as she observed him. Mr. Thorne, I believe you're not hearing me, Vera said, her voice sharp and direct. This trade agreement is crucial. Your reluctance to compromise is impeding progress. Max snapped back to reality, rubbing a hand over his tired face. Sorry, Vera. Let's take a step back, he said, forcing a smile he didn't feel. What are your main concerns? Vera stared at him for a long moment, as if measuring him, before speaking again, her tone still icy. You've been acting erratic ever since we arrived. Are you sure you're in a state of mind to lead this negotiation? The comment hit like a slap, and Max's pulse raced. He was supposed to be the calm, calculated leader, the one who made the hard calls. But right now, with his thoughts constantly straying to Saxa, he couldn't focus on anything else. I'm fine, Max said, trying to steady his breathing. I'll handle it, but the words felt hollow. He wasn't fine, and he had a growing suspicion that Saxa knew it. Hours later, Max was back at his apartment, the last of the Brizen delegates having left in a huff. He had promised them a follow-up in a couple of days, but right now, all he could think about was what awaited him at home. His heart gave a little leap when he saw her standing by the kitchen counter, leaning against it with a glass of water in her hand. Saxa. She looked calm, collected as always, her green skin radiant under the soft lighting of the apartment. But when she turned to look at him, there was something different in her gaze, something intense. Rough day, she asked, her voice low and smooth. The softness in her tone made his chest tighten. Yeah, Max muttered, shrugging off his jacket and running a hand through his disheveled hair. Just one of those days. Saxa's eyes flicked over him, taking in his appearance, the exhaustion etched into his face. She pushed off the counter and took a step toward him. You know, she said, her voice quieter now, you don't have to do this all on your own. Max looked up at her, meeting her gaze for the first time since he'd walked in. The connection between them was palpable, like a spark in the air, almost too much to bear. He felt the weight of her words sink into him. She was right. He didn't have to do it alone. I know, he said softly. I just don't want to burden you. Saxa smiled, a knowing, almost wistful smile. Max, I'm here for you. I've always been here for you. For the kids. For you, for all of it. Her words sent a shiver down his spine. There it was again, the unspoken bond, the pull between them that neither of them could deny. He took a step toward her, his chest tightening. I'm not sure how to navigate this, Max admitted, his voice rough. I feel like I'm losing control. You don't have to have all the answers, Saxa said softly, her hand reaching up, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead in a gentle, soothing motion. You're doing the best you can. That's all anyone can ask of you." Her fingers lingered on his skin, her touch electric. It was like everything he had been fighting, the attraction, the desire, finally came to a head. The pull was too strong to ignore. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, heavy with tension. Max could hear the rapid beating of his heart in his ears. He wanted to reach for her, to close the distance that separated them, but something held him back. A voice in his head, his conscience, the voice of reason, told him this wasn't right. She was his nanny, his employee. The age gap between them alone made this impossible. But that voice, that lingering doubt, was getting quieter with each passing second. The pull between them was too powerful. Saxa's voice was barely a whisper now, her breath warm against his face. "I need to tell you something." He could feel the heat rising between them. "What is it?" he breathed, his words coming out harsher than intended. Saxa's eyes flickered down to his lips for a split second before meeting his eyes again. "I've been fighting this too," she confessed. "Fighting the way I feel about you." Max's breath hitched in his throat. His heart thudded in his chest. She felt the same way? After all this time, all the tension, all the little moments of closeness, Saxa was telling him she was struggling with the same emotions? Before he could speak, before he could form another thought, Saxa closed the distance between them. Her lips found his in a kiss that was at once slow and desperate, tentative yet full of years of unspoken longing. Max froze for a moment, too stunned to react. But then, as her hands slid around his neck and her body pressed closer to his, he felt everything flood back. The need, the desire, the pulse of something deeper, something undeniable. He kissed her back, his arms coming around her, pulling her closer, needing her in a way that felt primal, urgent. His thoughts scattered, the weight of the world falling away as he lost himself in the kiss. Saxa moaned softly against his lips, and that sound, that intimate, breathless sound, drove him to the edge of control. But just as quickly as it had begun, the kiss broke. They pulled apart, both breathing heavily, eyes locked in a silent exchange of raw emotion. "I don't know how we move forward from here," Max said, his voice rough, his mind a storm of confusion and desire. Saxa's gaze was steady, her emerald eyes unwavering. "We take it one step at a time," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "But I'm not going anywhere, Max." Her words, the certainty in them, steadied him, even as the reality of their situation threatened to overwhelm him. He didn't know where this would go. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Saxa was no longer just his employee. She had become something far more complicated. And as much as he tried to fight it, as much as he told himself it was impossible, Max knew deep down that this was only the beginning of something much bigger, something that would change everything. The question was he ready for it? And more importantly, was she? The following days blurred together in a whirlwind of tension and unspoken words. Max was consumed by the weight of his professional life, his responsibilities as a father, and the ever-present attraction to Saxa. Every time they crossed paths, he felt the pull between them grow stronger, but there was always an invisible wall between them, a reminder of the lines they couldn't cross. He found it hard to focus on work. The Brizen negotiations were still in the balance, the trade deal teetering on the edge of collapse, but Max couldn't keep his mind on the task. Every glance, every moment he shared with Saxa felt like an electric charge waiting to explode. He couldn't help it. His eyes would linger a little too long, and when she'd smile, oh, that smile, it sent his heart into overdrive. That evening, after a particularly difficult day at the office, Max came home to find the apartment unusually quiet. The kids were asleep, as they usually were, and Saxa had just finished tidying up. She stood in the kitchen, a soft, welcoming light illuminating her from behind, her figure framed like something from a dream. "Hey," he said, his voice tight, trying to hide the mix of emotions swirling inside him. She turned, offering him a warm smile. "You look exhausted." "I feel exhausted," Max admitted, letting out a long breath. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, leaning against it for a moment. Another day, another negotiation failure. Sax's eyes softened with empathy, but there was something else there, too, a quiet, lingering heat that he could no longer ignore. "You can't carry all of this by yourself, Max," she said gently. "You don't have to be perfect." He sighed, rubbing a hand through his hair. "I don't feel perfect. I feel like I'm failing. At work, as a parent, at everything." She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. When she was near him, her warmth seemed to envelope him, and for a brief moment, all the noise of the world disappeared. "It was just them. You're doing better than you think," she said, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. "And you don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep trying." Max looked at her, then really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes that made his heart race. There was more there now than just sympathy. There was a deep, palpable understanding. And that was dangerous, because everything in him wanted to close the distance between them. He wanted to feel the warmth of her body next to his, to taste the temptation that had been building between them. He started to speak, but his voice faltered. Saxa didn't let him finish. She reached up, her hand gently cupping his cheek. Her touch was soft but firm, and he could feel the heat of her palm through the thin fabric of his shirt. "Don't," she whispered, her voice a mixture of yearning and restraint. "Don't say it, Max." The intensity of her gaze held him captive. There was no escaping it now. He could feel his pulse quicken, his body betraying him. He wanted her, but more than that, he needed her. But this was uncharted territory. He couldn't afford to cross that line. "I can't," he muttered, stepping back, his chest tight. "You're my employee, my children's nanny. This is insane." Sax's eyes darkened, but her voice remained calm, even as she reached out, pulling him back toward her. "I know the rules, Max, but sometimes the rules don't matter." His breath caught. "What are you saying?" She took a step closer, her voice low and earnest. "I'm saying that you don't have to do this alone. I'm saying that I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Before he could respond, Saxa kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, but then, as his lips met hers, the kiss deepened, igniting something within him that he hadn't even known was there. His body responded before his mind could catch up, his hands tangling in her long, white hair, pulling her closer. He knew he should stop. He knew he should end this, pull away before it went too far. But in that moment, all of his doubts, all of his self-restraint melted away. The kiss broke, and they stood there for a moment breathless, eyes locked. "Are you sure?" Max asked, his voice low, his heart hammering in his chest. Saxa's smile was all warmth, all certainty. "I'm sure," she replied, her hand gently caressing his jaw. "And I think, deep down, so are you." His mind screamed at him to stop, to think rationally. But his heart, the part of him that had been silent for far too long, knew this was right. It had always been right. Without another word, Max pulled her closer, his lips claiming hers again, this time with more urgency, more need. His hands traced down her back, feeling the curve of her spine, the warmth of her skin. Saxa responded eagerly, matching his hunger with her own. It was reckless, it was dangerous, but it was also inevitable. For the first time in a long time, Max let go. He didn't care about the rules. He didn't care about the consequences. He cared about the way she made him feel alive, seen, and wanted. And that was something he'd been missing for a long time. The moment was raw, passionate, and filled with the kind of intensity that could only come from two people who had been holding back for far too long. When the kiss finally ended, both of them breathless and slightly disheveled, they stood in the silence, the weight of what they'd just done sinking in. "I think we've crossed that line now," Max said, his voice rough. Saxa's eyes shone with a mixture of emotions, desire, uncertainty, and something deeper. "We did," she whispered. "But now we figure out what comes next." Max's heart raced as he realized the enormity of what he had just done. This was no longer just a passing attraction. This was real, complicated, and full of consequences. But for the first time in months, he wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. With Saxa by his side, he knew that he wasn't alone anymore. And that, in itself, was a terrifying yet beautiful thought. The end.